Good evening, Carl.
Hey, Randy,
Good to see you.
episode
Good to see you.
22.
Yeah, yeah.
And as I was
I
just
guess
mentioning to you, I'll give my friend Seth a shout out. He told me and I verified it. We are now in the top 1%. When he sent it to me, I thought, boy, we must have had an episode go viral and we're about to get rich on this thing. After clarifying question, that was not what he was saying. We're in the top 1% of podcasts ever started because only 1% of all started podcasts make it past 20 episodes. So we're in rare air and we'll just keep going.
wow.
So it's fun.
Well, it works out like that when you're doing something you really enjoy rather than something you feel like you have to do. So,
Yeah, it doesn't. I feel very fortunate. I was telling somebody today that I don't feel like I go to work, and if I do, I should probably have a conversation myself because I have control over that. And then I get to come home and do this that definitely is not work, which is good because we don't get paid to do it. So I look forward to this every week and it's fun.
all right. Well, tonight's topic is something that you and I had briefly talked about it way back when we were first thinking about topics to try to discuss on this podcast. And what made me really think about it just about 10 days ago, I rewatched one of my favorite comedy movies. Not one of the great movies, but one of the more hilarious and silly ones, and that's Talladega Nights.
Well, that's a classic.
Just I love that movie, and the probably the most quoted phrase or sentence to come out of that movie is, "If you're not first, you're last." And of course, it was funny in the context of that movie, and actually, that movie was very much built around that that particular philosophy,
Yeah.
and how chasing that particular dream of always being first had its impact on the lives of the various and sundry characters. But I started to look at some of the things going on in our world today, and beginning to wonder if maybe that sort of win at all cost mantra pervades our thinking as a culture, probably worldwide, but in particular in the United States. And, my daughter, I know that you and I both have been involved in youth sports through our daughters because of their activity in that. My daughter was on traveling softball, traveling volleyball. She was on a gymnastics team, dance team, everywhere. It seemed like every weekend we were involved in some sort of competition. And then for about 6 years, I coached a young girls traveling basketball team. And I saw firsthand, as I'm sure you have, the advent of the helicopter parent, of parents spending upwards of 20, 30,000 a year to get their children in very, very exclusive clubs, traveling clubs, that sort of thing, hiring private coaches, this sort of thing. And then the emphasis on, some of the vitriol that you would hear in the stands from parents, some that you would hear on the sidelines from coaches, in which it seemed like kind of the game or the joy of the game got lost in this desire to win at all costs, whatever it happened to take. I remember I had my young girls team that I started coaching these girls when they were in the eighth grade and coached them every year until they turned 13. When they got into junior high, middle school, I turned them over to those coaches. But I had during that tenure, one of the rules that we had, the way that we ran our program was that every girl on the team played an equal amount in every game. And I had about four fathers who pulled their daughters off of our team because we weren't emphasizing winning. And of course, in every instance, their daughters should have been playing every minute of every game, and to have them sit on the sidelines and then not to get upset about a loss, that sort of thing. And I had one of those fathers tell me, he says, "You're playing communist basketball." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, so everybody gets an even chance, and it doesn't matter who wins." I said, "Well, your analogy falls flat when you think about how the Russians and East Germans used to kick our butts in the Olympics for 3 decades."
Yeah.
So I said, "I don't think that that's what I would call communist basketball." But it was interesting that you see that at the young traveling sports end of things, but we've seen it at all levels. Certainly in athletics, we see it happening right now with NIL, and it doesn't matter what it costs. If I need a great team on the South Plains, because at the end of the day, it's all about winning. And you've got coaches like Sark, which I heard somebody say this week that he might be on the hot seat if they only go 9-3 and don't make the playoffs. And the sad thing is, there's that possibility.
Yeah.
It certainly is a possibility out on the plains of West Texas,
Yeah.
with my alma mater.
They
And then
mentioned,
you
and
see
one of
it.
the guys I heard talking about, they mentioned Joey Maguire and Sark in the same sentence, and the same it was Josh Pate, and he said both of those are completely asinine, but don't think that it's out of the realm of possibility.
Right, right. And then, you get outside of the arena of sports, and let's face it, it now pervades our politics. It's all about winning, and it doesn't matter how much it costs. And at the end of the day, I think for a lot of us who follow politics and have a particular political party that we might choose to endorse, it's all about our party winning. Maybe not necessarily having the best person as our congressman or congresswoman or president or whatever, but as long as our team wins, and we've seen the kind of turmoil that it creates. If you're on the team that didn't win. And, if my guy didn't win the presidential election, then I'm going to spend the next 4 years doing everything I can to get in the way and put a stumbling block in front of his or her agenda. And so, it's one of those things that, and going back to sports, I have seen the emphasis on winning and the lack of success that some parents desired for their children. I've seen that get in the way of best friends or families that were very close. And one blames their series of losses on the pitching of their good friend's daughter and this sort of thing. So it's really gotten silly. And I think that it's about as silly as if you ain't first, you're last. But I worry about the fact that we allow this big emphasis on winning at all costs. It's almost as though if I'm not winning, or if my guy's not winning, or if my team is not winning, somehow or another that casts some sort of a dispersion, some sort of a reflection on me. And by being associated, then I guess that makes me a loser as well. And of course, there's one of the problems with the whole concept of winning is if there is a winner, there must be a loser. And what then does that mean? And so I think there are a lot of things that we need to, as individuals, that we need to take a look at when it comes to this emphasis on winning. And I'll tell you, I don't know that there's a country. I can't speak for all time, but there probably isn't a country in the world right now in which winning is more important. I guess you could say North Korea, but it's just a big deal in the United States. And as we get into football season, and right now we're into all of us are yelling about the AP poll and the coaches poll, which really mean nothing. It won't matter till we get into February and crown a college football champion. But it really is kind of, this is the time of year when it kind of pervades our thinking. But it makes me concerned about things such as, are we making, as a country, are we making decisions that affect all of us, such, and are we refusing to acknowledge? I'm just going to get right out to, are we willing to acknowledge that we got ourselves involved in a war? That number one, we're probably going to have a hard time extracting ourselves from, and how much of that unwillingness to do what is necessary to extract oneself from any kind of a conflict is to save face. We don't want to admit that either we made a wrong decision or that this is something that we cannot win. We always have to come, and then, I guess this takes us to the first thing that I want to ask you, and maybe it's the place we need to start, and that is, how do we define winning? Particularly as you and I see it in our culture and the goals, our personal and professional interactions with other people. What, in your opinion, what does winning look like? Not, I'm not asking you yet what winning should be. What does it look like in the U.S.? Let's just
Yeah.
restrict it to
So
our country.
yeah, you said a lot of things, and I think you teed it up nicely. I always like to kind of start out with defining things, but my upfront disclaimer, I always seem like I've got one. I'm as competitive as anybody I know. I absolutely love winning and I hate losing. So
Mhm.
I
Okay,
want to
that's
caveat
good.
that at the front. It's not to say that any of that's bad. And I think that's the problem too, is we tend to overcorrect sometimes, like, oh, winning sucks. And no, I think there's most successful people will tell you I've heard Nick Saban say it, and I tend to agree. I really like winning. I hate losing more than I hate winning, or I hate losing more than I actually like winning, and that can drive you. And so, I think some of the things you said, which is interesting, in sports, there's a natural winner and a natural loser. I think that's unique about sports because in every scenario, there doesn't have to be a loser. And in negotiations, war, we can circle back around to that. I don't know that anybody wins, first of all. It's kind of who loses to the lesser degree. Because if you had a bunch of people die, humanity didn't win. So it's like who's winning, who's losing. Once you engage in a war, it's only limiting bad outcomes. World War One, World War Two, who won? Well, a lot of people lost. You can say who came out on the better end of losing, but it's hard for me to just say, man, victory. And again, I love this country. I'm patriotic, so it's not. Some people may misunderstand that. I'm like, no, again, I love winning. I hate losing. But I think the problem, and I'm going to circle back to defining it, I think the problem is some people, some cultures, and I see this as being the problem with winning right now. And I see it in negotiations. I've had customers in the past. I've worked with people in the past that it wasn't just enough for them to win. If they won and they didn't think you lost, then they didn't win. And if I look at the flaw of the philosophy of win at all cost, it's not even just the I want to win at all cost. It's the I want to win at all costs and I need you to lose. And I've brought this up before, but an impactful thing to me was rereading How to Win Friends and Influence People back in the mid 20 teens. And it really changed my perspective on arguing. I still love a good spirited debate. You know that. I've had that a lot, but it's not in a way that I want you to lose a debate or I have to win. It really is when you and I have debates, we have a mutual understanding and respect, kind of the genesis of this podcast. I have realized others don't always have the same perspective when having a healthy debate. I don't necessarily want to be right when I'm having a debate, a discussion. My main intent of a lot of those is to really come away, test my opinions, and figure out if I am right or not. And I'm willing to say, dang it, I didn't know that. I'm not right. Went back and did some research and I realized I was not. So being right in an argument is not my end all be all. It really, a lot of my debates are to figure out, am I right or wrong or what? And I think, so what is winning in a score? It's who has the most points, in sport. Winning in gymnastics is different in figure skating because if somebody's opinion thought you won, college football is to get to play for the ultimate national championship. It's somebody's opinion of whether they think your schedule was better and you won the right thing. So, beauty contest and a football game itself are a little different because there's a clear winner and loser in a football game. Somebody scored more points than somebody. Rarely there are ties, but very few times. And I think that's fine. And I think there's actually a healthy thing in youth sports to keep score and not say there is. By the way, the kids always know what the dang score is. If they don't, the parents do.
Yes.
So this whole nobody's keeping score thing is a bunch of BS because everybody knows what the score was and they walk off. It just makes the league officials feel better, I guess. My daughters both, you talked about youth sports. I coached both of them in basketball for a number of years. They've played soccer, a lot of things, travel. So I've seen tons of it. I've seen parents who are idiots. What I've seen is the parents are always bigger idiots than any of the kids I ever saw. And they had a desire to win by far more than the kids, and the kids were competitive. And it was at an all cost type thing. But the thing that's intriguing to me is I don't think it's unhealthy to teach a kid about winning and losing. I think they need to learn to win and be graceful winners. I think they need to lose with dignity. That's the game. I've said a lot that the game of life, your batting average is probably 300 at best. So you're going to lose a lot. You need to be comfortable with that. So I don't have an inherent problem with trying to win. It really comes
Mhm.
down to, and again, I love winning. I hate losing. I'm super competitive. To me, it comes down to the how. The real problem, and it's what you said, the at all costs. And I've got that in quotes all over my notes. The at all cost problem is where I think we start running into a lot of issues. And winning in in a political debate election, and then on the other side of the election, once you're going, it's like, what are you trying to win? Are you trying to win because you're a Republican or a Democrat, or are you trying to win for America? And that, again, the at all cost and the money that gets involved bastardizes a lot of things. But to me, again, winning is in a score in a game is very clearly the person with the most points wins. If you're playing marbles, the person with the most marbles takes all the marbles. That's how marbles works. So there are things that are clear winners and losers, but and I think that's healthy. I think that competitive spirit is fine. I wouldn't want to see that go away. I taught my kids. My kids are both super competitive. I have no issue with that. But any of the sports teams I coached, which was really just basketball, with both of them over the span, probably coached the two of them together for is probably 10 or 12 years total, all rec league stuff. At 12, you did 13 at 12. I handed them off to coaches who were better at basketball than I was and let them really figure out how to play it. But my goal, the first thing was to simply teach them about the game and help them. If I get them to dribble left-handed, that'd be awesome. Shoot, left-handed layup, that'd be awesome. Dribble without looking. Those were like the fundamentals of basketball I was trying to work through as they got older. But it really, my thing was always, and I said this before and after every game, we were going to work hard. We were going to give it a lot of effort. We were going to be very coachable and we're going to have a good time. That was it. That was all I wanted to do. And after every game, whether we won or lost, I'd ask the girls, all right, did we work hard? They're usually all red faced and sweating. I'm like, all right, looks like everybody worked hard. And in the league we were in, we had to play. It was interesting because during the regular season, everybody had to play. Everybody had to get a certain number of minutes, regardless. That was the rules. Once we got to All Stars, which was a different thing, that really was trying to win. The stated goal from the league was your goal is to take the best players from the teams and go win and see how far you can go. So that didn't mean everybody got equal playing time. And boy, that caused a lot of problems because everybody was used to the regular season where everybody got equal
Right.
playing time. And I had a dad come up to me. He was ready to fight me after a game that was very close. I mean, we got beat by a couple of points, I think. It was just a dogfight the whole game. And his daughter didn't get in the game. And what I knew, because that had happened to my daughter before, but they got better just from practicing. And the league usually did a good job. They didn't this year of explaining, hey, if your daughter makes the all star team, especially as a younger kid, they're going to get better for next year because they're competing against in practice better opponents. And so I don't think they got that message. And he was ready to fight me. I mean, I really thought we might come to blows. And he was so mad that I'd ruined his daughter's life, all this stuff. I'm like, man, that's rough. And so to me, again, winning's not the problem, losing's not the problem. The how is the real problem. So, we'll dive into some of that. But it's the at all cost problem that to me becomes the problem with
Yeah. Well, when I look at, and part of this is because, you reach a certain age, you look back and you remember those times when winning almost at all cost in some ways maybe affected some of your judgment, or maybe how you related to people because you felt like you had to win. I've reached a point now where let's say I play you in something and I win. So what? What does that change? There are certain things that we have monetarily compensate for winning. The person who wins a PGA tournament gets more money than the person who finished second, although it's hard to say any of those guys really lost, at least through the first 40 positions anyway. And certainly in the political realm, perhaps it provides you, if you win, greater influence in decisions that are made. Maybe you have a chance to impact your constituents more so than the one who lost it. So I understand, and I have no problem with there being winners and losers, at least in those things that you can quantify. Now we get into certain things. You've already mentioned some of the things in sports, diving, gymnastics, many of these sports that basically the winners are determined by judges who are just people who have a particular perspective. I think you're right. Getting into the college football playoff to a large extent is just someone's opinion. Even when you get into things like the British Open and the winner is the champion golfer of the world. No, they're
me.
not. Only because somebody said that they were.
Yeah. Well, it's like the NBA and NFL, that always makes me happy. Their champion is the champion of the world. I'm like, but you only played teams in the United States, so it's intriguing.
Right. So in a lot, to a large extent, the concept of winning and losing is something that is. I mean, we always hear that the fastest human on Earth is the world record holder in the 100 meters. What if somebody arbitrarily decided 100 meters? What if it had been 115 meters? What if it had been 65? So to a large extent, much of what we refer to as winning and losing is something that it's an arbitrary benchmark. It's an arbitrary title that is granted to a team or an individual or a, political party or whatever.
I do think
And
so. One thing about, I was sitting there thinking as you're saying that, I think there's an interesting thing that is in our human DNA because you can go back. I mean, think about how long ago the Olympics started. Think about, the Roman Colosseums. There's something about competition that's deep in our DNA. And I don't think
Mhm.
that's unhealthy. I still love to compete at whether it's I don't care if we're playing ping pong, anything. I love to do that. I love to win, but in the right way and healthy. So I think there's something about that. I think again, a lot of what we're talking about is an unhealthy manner of winning. I do have it's not Webster's dictionary. I didn't consult Webster on this one, but it's kind of a interesting wording that I liked. What you asked earlier, I never really defined it. What is winning? And I thought this summed it up well. And it says some of what it is more than just a score. Winning is achieving a worthwhile objective in a way that strengthens or at least does not betray the person you want to be, the people you care about, and the values you claim to hold. I'm like, and that can go across a lot of
That's
different
good.
areas. And that gets into the
Mhm.
how. You're not hurting anybody else. You're not excited that they lost. You're staying true to who you are, but you can win. So, and it really is, I think one of the things, and to what you were just saying, is the worthwhile objective. A lot of things people are trying to win or not win. I'm like, is it you're putting a lot of energy into this and a lot of calories, and was it even a worthwhile objective of the thing you were trying to win?
Right, right. Well, and I think we've already talked about this, but it's the win at all cost mentality that I think is really where you get to into this area of certainly a very slippery slope, if not something worse. When you think about the sort of win at all cost mentality that we see so often, how have you seen that impact the way that we interact with other people?
Yeah. And I think one thing too that I saw that I want to say or I'll forget, I think that you really can kind of bend out the pieces of winning. And you and I have talked about this, my nature, and I think you recognize this in me pretty early in us knowing each other. Getting the trophy, getting the outcome, getting the win is not my favorite part. I enjoy all the work, building a team, doing the preparation, the process of getting to the win. Again, I don't like to lose, so that drives me probably to build the process better. But once we find out we won, it's like, okay, cool, that's good. But the process and all the buildup I enjoy as much. And so there's kind of phases of how the winning happens. You can focus on the outcome, you can focus on the process, and then there's the integrity of it to me that kind of underpins the whole thing. That again, kind of healthy winning, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But to me, there's winning of the outcome and winning of the process. And again, if I did the process very well, this from we lost more proposals than we won in defense contracting. If you can bat 300, you're doing pretty well. But I never got mad about a single one of them. And I always felt like if we put everything on the table that we had and we lost, there's nothing else we could do. If we messed something up, that was frustrating. We need to go fix that. But as long as we did the thing well, the outcome, you really did everything you could to affect it in the right way. That's okay. But winning at all costs, and I've got a whole section here that I talked about. I do think there's a good argument for winning culture. Our country is a really good example of that. We do have a winning culture. I think you're right. I think there's no country on the face of the planet. North Korea wants to win because if they don't, little Kim gets killed. So I think the genesis of ours is a healthy place of why we want to win. I think it's devolved and it's not necessarily as healthy, but and we've talked about this on previous podcasts, the innovation that happens here, it doesn't happen in other places. So winning can drive innovation. It can encourage a lot of discipline and preparedness. It forces improvement, responsibility. It does teach us to recover well from failure because if you're in the arena and you're trying to win, you're going to lose. So there's goodness in that. And everybody can raise their standards. I think that's some of the healthy problems. The problem is when you get into the win at all cost piece, that is where you get into it. And it's where it feels like this sums up, politics very well and sports also. You get into cheating, unethical things, treating people as commodities. You see that in business a lot where people are just a cost and they're a piece of the P&L. They're not really people. Chronic stress and burnout, because I'm just trying. And I think that's when you're chasing the mythical ghost that's winning. And you think if I can just get another dollar or another win, I'm going to be happy. It's what emphasis do you place on winning? If that's your end all be all, that's a miserable. You hear a lot of professional athletes. I know Deion Sanders has talked about it. David Duvall used to talk about it. I mean, I can go on the list. Dennis Rodman's talked about it, where they hit some of the lowest times in their life right after they win the biggest thing. Because they've spent
Mhm.
their entire life from the time they were 4 years old to get this trophy or whatever the thing is. And they look around like, that's it. That's all there is. And that's really sad. But, the chronic stress, burnout, how many neglected marriages and families and everything else do you see? Inability to enjoy the success because the next contest always begins. Again, I think that's Saban was that way, but I don't think it was necessarily because of winning. The more I've studied him, I think it's because he genuinely loved the process of getting there and he was just ready to go do that again. Again, I share that. I enjoy winning a little bit more than he did early on before 2011, the tornadoes. After that, he seemed to take at least a day or two and enjoy it. The fear, this is a bad thing for culture, and it depends on what you place on winning and the emphasis as a culture of an organization or a family or whatever, is the fear of failure being so strong that you start getting things being hidden, mistakes covered up. People aren't willing to take risks, because you're so worried about winning that you actually become risk averse and you can't even win a bigger game. And I think this is a sad one, and we were just saying it, is your identity gets wrapped up in winning and whether you win or not. And that's a thankless, especially in the game of life when you lose a lot. To me, yeah, I said this earlier, this is my biggest problem with the winning at all cost mentality. So many people right now, and I think it's a problem with how kids are being raised, a lot of the school systems. It's why everybody wants to hate a billionaire, is there's this zero sum mentality of winning. And if Elon's winning, somebody must be losing. If Jeff Bezos is winning, somebody must be losing. It's not if Jeff Bezos is winning, there's a million people that work for Amazon. And so for me to rise, you've got to fall. And I think it's this balance of if I win, you got to lose. And then people are viewing that in general, that if they see somebody winning, they ultimately assume, and it is the case for some people, that they screwed Bernie Madoff. He won, at least in the short term, because he screwed a bunch of other people and a bunch of other people lost. But the people that have done it in a sustaining manner, they didn't do it by screwing people. They did it over a long period of time. They won the right way, and people around them benefited. So I think that zero sum mentality, it's a lot of people call it the famine mentality, is a lot of the problem with winning. Of I'm trying to win, so I'm not going to share with you. I'm not going to help you. I've listened to Rogan talk a lot about it, and I was listening to some other people talk about it on a different podcast the other day, and they were all talking about what Joe's done for them with comedy. And he really changed comedy. There was a famine mentality in comedy. Nobody would share, work with each other. They wouldn't work out things. It was all, and they were trying to steal each other's jokes. And it started happening at the Comedy Store in LA. But when he moved to Austin and started the Mothership and started moving all these comedians there and what they've got now, and I don't think it's a mystery that comedy is as popular as it's been since probably the late 80s, early 90s right now. And it's just intriguing. He gives, it's usually 20% of the door goes to the comedians. He does 80%. He's not trying to make money on the club because he's got his podcast deal. But you look at what it's done for comedy, and by the way, he's still winning. He he hasn't lost a bit. He'll help you start a podcast, whatever. It's just, but that famine zero sum mentality, I think, is a lot of what gets associated with winning, and it gives winning a bad reputation.
Mm. That's well put. In fact, you just you really put a good bow around the next question I was going to ask you, and you've already answered it, which is, do we maybe need to redefine winning? Because I think that, there are a lot of different definitions out there, and people view this. There are those who would say, well, you're not hard enough. Yes, when somebody wins, somebody loses. There has to be a loser. I agree with you. There can be a winner, and there can be a lot of other people that win along with that. Where I see the greatest concern for me in terms of the direct impact on those of us here in this country, I'm talking about my country, the United States, the idea of win at all costs, how has it influenced government decision making over the years? I'm not talking about just in the last 3 or 4 election cycles, but I'm talking about in the history of our nation. For whatever reasons we may have entered into conflicts, for example, around the world. And we've touched on this quite a number of times over the last several weeks. In my lifetime, and there are going to be people out there now that are going to completely disagree with what I say here, and that's okay. That's fine. It's as we used to always tell our daughter when she was growing up, certain things are not a winning game. And so I'm not trying to win on this particular point, but from my perspective, we were involved in a war in Korea that we did not win. We were involved in a war in Vietnam that we did not win. We were involved in a war in Iraq where we accomplished the stated goal, but looking at how things evolved from there the decade since, I don't think we would call that a win. We're in the midst of a conflict right now, which I don't see any way we are going to win. And yet it seems like the government refuses to acknowledge a defeat, and they tend to view if we made a change of direction or a change of decision, then that's acknowledging that we were wrong or that we made a mistake. And therefore, if we made a mistake, we must be losers. I worry about the direction that this takes us. And you see it in other areas. Get away from the war side. The side that wins the presidential election, all too often believes that they now get to enjoy the spoils of that war. And they get to make all decisions because they won 51% of the popular vote as opposed to 49%. And I it concerns me, and the other thing is that we often excuse some of the decisions that we make, some of the actions that we take as the price that we have to pay in order to win. And it raises the question, is that really a win?
Yeah. One thing too, and you mentioned it with all the different conflicts. I guess none of them are technically wars. We've only had a couple of those in the history of the world that we've been part of. But in those conflicts, and if you go back, I don't remember what episode it was. It was early, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the early single digits. We talked about the conflict in Iran. You said something earlier about Iraq, and our original stated goal was to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. Well, it's kind of like unicorn hunting because it turns out they really didn't exist. So whether we really did hit all of our stated objectives or not is probably debatable. I think that's a real problem though, and I think it's the more I think about it, I think it's by design because if I don't really state objectives and I'm playing this game that there are no objectives that are stated in the beginning of this is what winning and this is what losing looks like, I can declare victory at any point I want to when I decide I'm going to quit and say, we won. You and I said this. I mean, I distinctly remember it when we were talking about and the problem with entering this conflict is, and if we were, king for a day, you have to state the objective. And when you meet that objective, you have to quit and say, we met the objective. Or if you realize said objective can't be met, sometimes it's better to cut bait and say, this isn't winnable instead of continuing to the human toll on both sides. And it's, you and I talked about this. It was one of my frustrations is we don't have a stated objective. What is that? We talked about it because okay, is it to end the nuclear program? I thought we did that. I was having lunch with a friend of mine today. It's weird because it feels like, we were told we ended the nuclear program with Operation Midnight Hammer. And then a few months later, it's like, well, we didn't completely obliterate it like we said we obliterated it. So we're going to go obliterate it again, but we did it this time. And I was like, I don't know if we did. So when you have these changing objectives and you don't clearly state, here's why we're going to enter this conflict, here's our objective. When we accomplish this, we're finished. Or, by the way, if we can't accomplish it, we see the toll's too high, we're going to reevaluate and be very clear on that. And I think that's one of the things that you mentioned Vietnam, Korea. What was our objective in any of those? They were all false flag events where this thing happened, Gulf of Tonkin, whatever, that now we got to get involved. But there was no stated objective. And,
Well, it's
again,
don't you remember the domino theory?
yeah.
If
Oh,
one
yeah.
southeastern nation falls, they're all going to fall.
Yeah, same. I mean, we're working on the Middle
Hadn't
Eastern
turned
one
out that
too,
way.
and the problem is, if you again, what's winning and what's losing, and I've got an interesting juxtaposition at the end of this whole thing I want to share. But I think defining winning is very important. Whether you're leading a team at work, you're coaching a youth basketball team, because my goal of ultimately winning in each season is if I had kids that showed back up the next year that liked basketball, that was winning. If they showed up the next year, that was winning. And then my ultimate win, and Cassie and I've talked about this, was when I watched girls that we coached from the time they were 6 years old until they were 12. And then they ultimately went through middle school playing for somebody else. They got involved in travel ball, whatever. But we see them on the floor playing high school basketball, and they play 4 years of high school basketball. That's awesome. There was a girl, and she just graduated. She was the same year as Claire. Never had played basketball. She was 5'10". She was 12 years old. By the time the season ended, she's looking me eye to eye, and I'm 6'1", and she was shooting on the wrong end of the goal, and we taught her how to play basketball. And I used to kid with her. I said, JL, when you end up in the WNBA, remember Cassie and I were the ones who coached you. She went on and played for a state championship at Bob Jones last year. They did not win, but she got that far. And I'm like, that's what we were doing. That was winning. And all along, that was our stated objective of winning. It was if we would have won some stupid state championship and All-Star, wouldn't have cared. If all the girls didn't show back up the next year, then that would have been a miserable failure. And I think whether it should by all means be war, because these ones that keep dragging on, it's just more and more freaking people die. What's the objective of Russia and Ukraine right now? We're supporting one side. What's our objective? Why are we giving them, arms and money? What's Russia's goal? I think Russia's goal is clear. They're trying to reassemble, what they believe. Putin laid it out to Tucker Carlson. They're trying to reassemble what he believes is the Soviet Union. They're not getting there very quickly, and so people are just dying. But if you don't upfront very clearly, again, whether it's a sporting event, a business venture, whatever, state, here's what winning looks like. If you're hiring a new employee, they should always know every day what winning and losing looks like. And if you don't do that, it's this moving objective. It's easy to twist the story later of, who won what wars and what games, but it's not true. So that's one of my pet peeves of anything is, and it's risky, because if you state what winning looks like, then everybody's going to recognize if you won or not. If you don't, you can craft the message into whatever you want it to be. But the problem is the toll, and when does this thing end? It's kind of like, I don't understand cricket, but cricket's very hard for me to understand. It goes on for like a week. Like, I don't know how the hell they win or lose. They just keep playing. They stop for breaks. But I think that's a problem. With all the things you were talking about, listing off all those, I don't think that leadership did a very good job of defining, first of all, why were we going? We talked about this with the Iran thing. Why are we doing this? And what does winning look like? And when we win, when are we leaving? That's it.
It's interesting that everything that you just said makes so much sense. And I'd pulled some information just to see what the so-called experts out there have to say about adopting a win at all costs mentality. And whether you like psychology today or not, they came up with some things that I think all of us can look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. But as you were talking just now, I had applied what I learned in my research from these psychologists to strictly the sports environment. But it really applies to what happens or what can happen if you have a win at all costs mentality in the corporate boardroom, if you have it in the halls of Congress, if you have it at, the administrative level and in the US government. What they called out were some things, and I think we will recognize every one of these things. Some of the negatives to a win at all costs mentality. One is psychological and emotional burnout or exhaustion. High pressure tends to lead to mental exhaustion and early retirement from activities. It causes some people to just give up, just quit, and get out of that particular activity. Loss of motivation. People shift from the sort of intrinsic joy of loving an activity to the extrinsic awards of getting trophies and getting praise and this sort of thing. They mention anxiety and fear. The terror of losing creates an intense performance anxiety. And you've seen this as a CEO when someone, whether whether it was intentional or not, for whatever reason, they feel like they're under so much pressure and so much scrutiny that they hate what they're doing. They are less successful than they should be, that sort of thing. It tends to choke off any creativity because I'm afraid of making a decision that falls outside the box in that scenario. It can create, and you just mentioned this, an identity crisis where your entire self worth is tied to your achievement and the recognition of your achievement. And anything less than that, if they view themselves as a failure, it can lead to depression, that sort of thing. You've also mentioned this, the ethical and behavioral risks, the temptation to cheat, to cut corners, that sort of thing, in order to guarantee that you win while somebody else loses. Certainly an emphasis on that, and I've seen it in a couple of corporate scenarios in my life, can create a really toxic culture where everything within the organization becomes cutthroat, someone trying to take somebody else's job because they see that as a win and that person as the loser. And that's what, the whole idea of moving up the corporate ladder, regardless of who you have to step on the way up. And then the idea of this win at all cost coaching. And we've seen that at every level, from children's travel sports all the way up to the professional ranks, where sometimes, and you see this particularly, I saw it in high school. Okay. Played football in the state of Texas. Football's a big deal. Friday Night Lights. We had very good football teams, very good football coaches, but you can have mentors or coaches who prioritize victory over the safety and the health and the development of their players. And this can lead some people because of their strong desire to win at whatever cost can put themselves in danger where they play when they're injured and you know, rushing through recovery and getting back onto the court or onto the diamond or onto the field quicker than you should, which can create long term physical damage and actually ruin their career. Where's the win in that? The other thing is it can lead to, and you've touched on this, skill stagnation. It can stop me from trying a new technique, trying something different, taking a different approach because I know that I've achieved a certain level of success doing it this way,
Think about
and I'm
Tiger
so
Woods.
afraid of losing, going from being in a winning position to a losing position.
Think about Tiger Woods with that, and it's so intriguing. But Tiger had 7, swing changes, 4 of which were major swing changes. And most people would have killed to have his first one and keep winning. But think about what he had
Right.
to go through. And every time he did that, he got a different swing coach. Everybody thought he lost his mind. He would go reinvent himself and come back and be stronger. He was playing a different game. And I think to your point of the skill set stagnation of I'm just going to do it this way. If you're only, which Tiger was maniacal about winning. But that's where I think it can even become interesting, the misunderstanding of winning the process and the how
Right.
is if you're not winning that process, the winning of the outcome is your only focus. You got to win both of those because then you're so focused on the outcome part, you're not willing to go back and reinvent some of it to potentially be better because that's again, that feels a lot like the famine mentality to me. If I'm so worried this thing is scarce, there's not enough to go around. I got to go get what I can while I can, and I can't take time to reinvent myself because I may lose a few things. But you look at some of the greatest of all time, whether they were business leaders or athletes or whatever, there were some significant reinventions in there to keep their skill set and their craft relevant. And I think, again, a lot of people don't do that because they're so scared of not being, it's not even scared of losing, it's scared of not being able to win anymore. That's a different mindset.
Well, and you mentioned Tiger. He's a great example of exactly what you're talking about. Tiger lost occasionally, but I don't think, at least as a golfer, he ever considered himself a loser. And the when you've got that kind, I think he had the right perspective in terms of what winning and losing is. Michael Jordan, he almost won all the time, but he certainly lost games, but he never considered himself to be a loser.
He
And
talks about
so
it,
I
the
think
last shot, Wayne Gretzky talks about it, Jordan talks about it, think about how many last shots Jordan took, Kobe the same way. Did they make them all? No, absolutely not, but they made a lot of them, and they were the best one to be taking it, but they took the shot. If you don't take the shot, you don't even get the chance.
right. The last thing that Psychology Today mentioned, and we've both seen this, is the attrition that can happen in a win at all cost environment. High pressure environments tend to cause really pretty massive dropout rates, especially in things like youth sports. It can happen in the corporate environment. It can happen. People will give up their hobbies because they go out on the golf course and everybody is so hyper competitive and it's not an enjoyable activity any longer. Now, some people, especially if you're in youth sports or if this is a hobby, it's very, very easy to say, "Hey, I don't need this." Now, it's not always easy when you're in a profession or in a job working for a company, but what that will do is hurt your production.
Well,
Therefore,
and
it hurts
that
the entire company.
that's what I was gonna say, and that piece, man, I've seen it for so long. I've seen people in organizations where if you equate winning in the corporate world, winning is profit. That's just what it comes down to, especially in publicly traded companies. The judge of the scoreboard is, are you making enough profit? It's not who you developed, how you developed them. It's none of that. It's not are people's lives better off? Did you develop skill sets? It really, again, specifically in a publicly traded company, every 13 weeks, did your profit number meet you can't super exceed your number, you become unpredictable, but did it either meet or mildly exceed your prediction that you told the street? And I had some notes specifically around that piece, and I think it does apply to everything, but specifically in the corporate world, I think that gets so misunderstood that, and I love the book Atomic Habits. And in that book, all he talks about is focusing on the behaviors. And I think about, when the famine mentality says there's only so much success available. So if you get more, I must get less. I think about this in a corporate, profitability. We got to get all we can type mentality. The abundance mentality is I can pursue excellence while also expanding for other people around me. Same thing in the corporate environment a lot of times, like, oh, we got to get everything we can, screw our competition, we got to make sure they don't win. I don't know that that's the case. I've seen it work better, and we're proving it, with what we're doing right now. We're helping other people win. We're winning at a very high clip, especially when you look at what is winning. It's just not winning proposals. It's being my definition of winning at the company. You got to make profit. You've got to have revenue. That's the lifeblood of a company. So that goes without saying. But what is winning? And it'll segue into kind of my final thing before when we get around to closing. I think we got a little ways to go. But it really is winning for me is changing people's lives and creating a culture that they can work in and change their lives. I believe while focusing on that, we we will win our fair share of proposals. We will make profit. We are. And I think then, and this, it's a big, huge 10-foot circle on our wall in our atrium is balance. And I think that's an issue. You've talked about burnout. We've hit that a couple times, whether it's youth sports or anything. Scotty Scheffler talks about this, and I love it. I was kidding with Bob the other day. I said, Scotty has been in our atrium looking at our wheel of life that we developed, because he was talking about how does he play at the high level he's playing, but yet he's got Bennett and his new little boy. I can't remember what his name is, Levi Wrangler. I think it's a gene company of some sort.
One of those
But
jeans companies,
that's
huh?
right. He spends time with his kids. He's got what appears to be a good marriage. Plays a lot of golf. He's playing more golf than Rory is right now, and he's winning a ridiculous amount. He's finishing second when he's not winning. If he steps on the golf course, he's pretty much top three right now. But he said something the other day, and it really is the cliche piece of be where your feet are. I talk about it a lot. I love it. Focus on what you're doing, what's in front of you. Give it 100%, not 110. We don't have 110. Above 100, we die. But Scotty said that when he's at the range, hitting golf balls or on the course practicing, he doesn't want to be thinking about his wife and kids. When he's at home with his wife and kids, he doesn't want to be thinking about golf. And he gives each of those the proper attention when he's with them, and does not think about what he should be doing the other. And by all accounts, he looks like he's having a lot of fun with his family. He still plays freaking golf with his buddies. He's playing 13 to 15 handicap, spotting them 20 strokes. He's a +7 right now. And they're playing for money and having fun. So how in the world is he able to win at the clip he does? And this is where I think Tiger wasn't necessarily in that much balance. And so longevity wise, Tiger had a real longevity problem. He won at a really high clip for where he was super engaged, but the wheels fell off. His body fell apart. His family fell apart. Time will tell. I don't know Scotty. He's not my best friend. I've never met him. But looking at the way he's going about things, it appears he has more balance, and it is a more sustainable thing. And he's focused not just on winning. He loves winning. He talks about it. He can't stand, because they were talking about statistically his season. He's like, I don't care. I don't care about statistics. I want to win more. But that balance, we've talked about the faith, family, fun, finances, fitness, all of our F's on our wheel of life. I think to really win, you got to be able to do all of that, or else you're stealing from something. And one helpful distinction that I wrote down is, are you sacrificing or neglecting? And I'll ask of myself and anybody on our team to sacrifice. If we've got a proposal due, we're launching a new contract and a new geography, we may all have to go there, and we may all have to work 14 hours a day to onboard a bunch of people, make sure things are taken care of, which means we're going to be away from our family. That's sacrifice. I'm willing to sacrifice. I'm willing to ask other people to sacrifice. That's short term. That's something temporary for a worthwhile objective. Back up to what's winning. It's accomplishing a worthwhile objective. I'm willing to sacrifice whatever that is for a worthwhile objective. I am
Mhm.
not willing to neglect my family, anything. I'm also not willing to neglect my company for my family. I'm not willing to neglect my fitness for my company or my family. I'm not willing to neglect, my fitness, any of that. You can't neglect any one for the other. That's where the whole term of balance in our wheel of life comes from. You can sacrifice one for the other. When my mom was sick and going through cancer, I sacrificed some other things to be with her and make sure I needed to do that. If something happens with my family, I'm going to sacrifice for that. If something's going on at work, I'm going to sacrifice that. I'm not going to neglect my fitness, my family, the company, anything for long periods of time. to win in any one of those, because I think that's very unhealthy, and I think that leads to regret, and I think that's part of the problem now when we go all the way back to the beginning, we talk about wars, is if we don't define what winning is, and I think the problem is when you're trying to win in one little bitty specific area at all cost, that leads to a lot of regrets and things on the back end. You look back and say, "Man, probably could have done that differently." And if you don't have the self-reflection too, other people are definitely looking at you saying, "You should have done that a little bit different."
Right. That's so true. And you mentioned something about Tiger, which I failed to mention when I was using him as an example. I think he was definitely a winner as a professional golfer, but I'm not so sure that he was a winner in his personal life.
But yeah, that was a train wreck.
You know, and
And still is
and
paying for that.
yes, right, right. But when I look at things like this and I get sort of confused because I also am very competitive, you know that. My wife and I, even now, there's nothing we would rather watch on TV than some sort of a competition where at the end of the program, somebody wins, which I guess means somebody else lost. I don't know. And we are highly competitive with anything that the two of us do. We both just jumped into the ESPN College Football Weekly. I don't remember what ESPN calls it, but I've already got my first week's winners selected and that sort of thing. And we make a big deal about who ends up winning, which is usually her, by the way, at the end of every season. But
That makes everybody happier
so
though.
I enjoy it. I
Yeah.
enjoy that. I think the question is, what kind of an emphasis are we putting on that? Are we elevating winning to almost we're almost deifying it as though that is the ultimate goal that we should all aspire to. So when I get conflicted a little bit about kind of how I feel individually and then what the negative side of that I see play out in relationships, in strategy, and government decision making, etc. I go back to my old ministerial background and my theological upbringing, and so I kind of knew this going in, but I wanted to go back and check some of my resources to make sure that I was correct in what I was gonna say. First of all, the concept of winning, okay? I went back and checked and going back to as clearly as you can anyway, back to what we see in the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek texts. There's so many different translations of the Bible out there, and a lot of them I mean, and none of them are horrible, but a lot of them are, transliterations, somebody else's sort of take on what this means. So when I'm talking about something like this, and you can't always even go back to the Greek and the Aramaic because there can be disagreements over what that meant in context. So I go back to the old King James Bible, a version of the Bible, which I don't typically use on a daily basis as my study Bible, but just as a point of reference. So if you were to take the words win, winning, and won and see how they occur in scripture, the word win occurs one time in the New Testament. It never occurs in the Old Testament. There is the word winneth that is used one time in the Old Testament, and the word won, WON, occurs three times in the Old Testament, talking about a battle that was won by so and so. Jesus never used the words win, and he never used the word succeed. And yet, my note here that I made was, yet he succeeded in winning the battle against Satan on the cross and defeating death through his resurrection. So there was no bigger winner or greater success than the life of our Lord. And yet it is not something that you see him emphasizing or even hinting at. Now, the one place that I remembered, and I went back and looked at some of my notes about when Paul talked about running the race and, being, you know, physically prepared and to get the prize and this sort of thing, which seems to be a strong statement about winning and about success and about achieving a goal. But I went back and took a look at it and said, okay, what is it Paul is really talking about? And I kind of broke it down. First of all, he's talking about intentionality, that as Christians, we need to live our lives with a very clear spiritual focus in all that we do. And we need to avoid what he seems to be saying is don't waste your life. Okay. Don't
That's what I
don't
was
be
gonna say. I mean, I
careless
think if all that stuff,
with
he's
your life.
it's intentional and a life well lived. That's winning.
Yes, he emphasizes self-control in that particular passage, how we have to control our physical desires, and he related it to how athletes have to train. And, he talks about making certain that he's not disqualified. And then the reward that he's talking about that to obtain is a spiritual prize. And he's comparing it with this very, very temporary prize that the athletes in Rome who competed in the games were attempting to obtain for themselves,
I think it's interesting though, and
because
you just said that because I
the
think this
spiritual prize
concept of
lasts
winning.
forever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, and you just said it. Even though it wasn't mentioned in the Bible very much, it doesn't mean it just got invented and the dot-com boom didn't start winning. Because think about it, if Paul was using that as a reference, it was something that was at the front of everybody's mind of what a life well lived looked like, and he was relating it to winning. So I don't again, we talked about this was a human condition that's existed for a long time. It's become healthier or unhealthier depending on your view. But it's something that people have understood for a long time, and Paul was referencing that because it is a very very ancient concept of winning.
Right, right. No, absolutely. And it's interesting here. This was in Corinthians, and in Corinth, they hosted what was called the Isthmian Games, and I did not recall, but I know there were games that they held every 2 years, second only to the Olympics games that were held in Rome. So the people in Corinth completely understood. They had athletes that were training there and all hoping to win the wreath in their particular athletic endeavor. And so what he's doing is kind of contrasting that the effort and the discipline and the intentionality that these athletes put themselves through and committed themselves to just to get a wreath that mainly was made from hyssop or something like that that would eventually totally disintegrate. And he was comparing that with, and he was basically saying to those of us as believers, we're talking about an eternal reward, a much greater prize. And shouldn't we discipline ourselves in much the same manner?
So
Now,
think about this real
some
quick,
people have
Randy.
yeah, go ahead.
This is funny what I wrote down here, and it parallels so well with what you're doing, and what the kind of the second group of things I've written down aren't the eternal piece. But I believe if you looked at it, so many people quote the verse, when you get to a funeral of running the race, finishing well, it's on my dad's tombstone. He ran the race. And I think it's interesting because when you get to your end of your life, most people want to be remembered as, oh, that was a good life that they lived. And so what do you really focus on? And it's along with what you're saying and what Paul was challenging the people of his time to look at. And I think this is where, if I bring this forward to today, there is kind of this scoreboard problem. And it's these things that are quantifiable is what winning looks like. So think about whether it's your family and your status or a company or whatever. What are the things that, especially today with social media, are kind of easy to quantify? Money, wealth, revenue, titles, whether that's titles in sports or that's titles in a company. How many followers do you have?
Likes.
Yeah. How many
Yeah.
followers? How many followers do you have? How many likes did your post get? Championships, elections, status. That, unfortunately, I think is what's been conflated with winning. That's a very superficial, thankless race that when you get any one of those at the end of your race, you're going to look at it and say, boy, this sucks. That wasn't a lot of fun. Contrast that with, and it's in line with what Paul's saying, of a life well lived. If you do live a life of discipline, it's not the eternal piece, but it's about as well, in my opinion, as you could live a life here. Contrast that list of things I just said to some more important wins, I would argue. A strong marriage, children who actually want to be around you, later in life, who are productive citizens, who are doing the same things that you wanted them to do and carrying on, and they're being productive, good humans. That's good. Your reputation. We talked about it. I mean, that was what we talked about all along, is winning at all cost. You will not end up with a good reputation if you jeopardize everything your character is built upon to win. So on the other side, what if you got a trusted reputation? If you're in a company, you've got employees whose lives have improved because they've been part of your organization, physical and spiritual health. And then ultimately the ability to enjoy the process to get all that. And ultimately you enjoy, when you're in the kind of I heard, who was it the other day? Oh, Mac Brown. He was talking to Bob Blue and Vince Young, and they were talking about where you are in your life. And Mac's like, well, unfortunately, I'm not even just getting out of halftime. I'm kind of in the fourth quarter hoping for overtime at this point. But it's like when you're kind of in the fourth quarter hoping for overtime, it's like, how do you view your life if you're being really honest with yourself? Are you fulfilled? I don't think you're going to be fulfilled because of money, titles, election status, championships, house size. Man, I think when you look back though, and I just with the pieces I've seen so far and where I am, and I'm kind of in the third quarter now. I figure I've come out of halftime and said ready break, and I'm somewhere in the third quarter if God deems the same thing. But those things in that second list sure feel like the things that'll be fun to look back on and say that was what winning in life looked like. That feels
Mhm.
more permanent, longer lasting, and more positive than any of the first list.
It's interesting, Carl, something you said earlier on, which is, I think the Apostle Paul would agree with you. The idea that for you, it's about the process. It's not about the end reward, that sort of thing. That's what's really important. And I think that's what Paul was talking about in this particular passage. It's this concept really of grace versus legalism. Some people have read this passage and I think misinterpreted it to imply that your salvation is contingent upon your works or your effort. And I don't believe that's what Paul is saying. When he talks about running the race, what a lot of people don't know the context or the background, but in these ancient games in Rome, only citizens could compete. Slaves and foreigners, those outside of the citizenry of Rome, could not participate. So running in the race didn't make you a citizen. You were already a citizen of Rome and therefore allowed to participate. And spiritual discipline doesn't equate to salvation. Discipline, at least the way I see it, as Paul is talking about here, is the evidence of the workings of a life that has already been transformed by grace. So salvation is through the work that Christ did and the victory that he won on the cross and in his resurrection. We are able to participate in the race because of his grace. But what Paul is painting a picture here is the divine calling that's on all of our lives as followers of Christ. And that's why we need to have the discipline. We need to have the goal of achieving basically that life that God has called us into. And and it's also interesting, he uses a word, it's translated, he wants to make certain that he's not rejected or he's not and it's really what the Greek word that's there, he calls it being disqualified, okay? And what it really means is one who has been judged as unfit or unapproved to participate. And so what he's saying is that he wants to make certain that his life, his day-to-day life, is such that it doesn't disqualify him from the calling that God placed upon his life. In other words, he could not go out and do whatever he wanted and ignore the teachings of Christ and then still expect to be able to lead people to a saving knowledge of Christ. So that's what this whole discipline is not about, winning a race and achieving a crown here on earth, but it is this whole and you've described it. I mean, that's exactly what you have on the walls there at TTGI. That spiritual component that you call out should pervade all of the other aspects of our life. At least that is my belief as a Christian. And so when you want to talk about winning, the victory has already been won. And based on that, I need to discipline my life, to be intentional with my life and my decisions, to make that commitment and make those kinds of sacrifices that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And
And
if we could do that as a nation, as humanity, and let that be the guide and sort of the definition of the ultimate winner, I think we'd be in a lot better position. The
yeah,
only way that I know to even contribute to achieving that is to love God and to love people,
I was gonna say
and let
when
that be.
Jesus was asked what was most important, what was it? Love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. It's really what we're talking about. And I wrote down a little bit here that, we started out kind of defining what winning through all this. And then after I did all my research, like, all right, what is winning to me? And again, I'm super competitive. I want to win. And then you keep using the word intentional. So you've teed up kind of the last thing I've got here at the very end. our friend John Maxwell, who wrote 4,000 books on being intentional. He didn't ever have a good thought he hadn't written down, but they're all really good. So, I want to win. I'm willing to work. I'm willing to sacrifice. I'm willing to take calculated risk. But what am I not willing to do? I'm not willing to sacrifice my character, destroy the people around me, or make achievement my identity. If I don't win, is it going to crush who I am? I'm not willing to do that. Also, the best kind of winning, it doesn't require everyone else to lose in my life. It creates opportunity, raises the standards, and brings other people along. Winning is a worthy objective. It's a terrible identity. So pursue winning relentlessly, pursue it honorably, and never let the prize become more important than the person you become or cease to be to obtain it. And then lastly, also the journey can be the win. And that's what Paul was talking about, right? I mean, we know who wins. Jesus won. We all won because of Jesus. So then that whole mentality puts a lot more on the process because we're not playing a game anymore. We're doing the process. And so, the journey and the destination, or the destination and the trophy, may not be the actual win. It can be the process. And then this is the question that I like a lot, and it's one of my favorite things from John Maxwell is, and this is kind of the question I continually ask myself: do we want to win? Do we want to be successful? Or do we want to be significant? John Maxwell's got a
Mm,
quote I absolutely love. Success is when I add value to my success. Success is when I add value to myself. Significance is when I add value to others. And, I think that's what it really looks at. And to be significant, winning at all costs can't be your goal. It just can't be. You will not be significant. You may be significant, if you subscribe to the all news is good news. You can be significant. Bernie Madoff is significant. I wouldn't say in a positive way though. So, it
right.
really comes down to what do you want, and again, it's not anti-winning. It's just really defining what is winning. And if you're winning means everybody else loses and it's at all cost, that doesn't line up with, Jesus or Paul's message very well. It really is at the end of the day, when you've got a few breaths left, it depends on what do you want that to be judged. And my guess is I don't believe when we get to the gates and knock on the door and it opens up, I don't think anybody's going to ask us what our profitability, revenue, how many trophies we got, especially when we were 10. I just don't think that's what the ultimate winning or success or significance is going to be. I think it's going to be, how'd your family look? Were people around you better off because you existed? The things you endeavored to pursue, did they make people better? I love the African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And for many years, I've found a lot more joy in doing things when you're doing them with others. And even if you lose, it makes it more fun when you're doing that too, if you do it the right way. But I think this thing is. I think it's not that hard in concept. Not many of the things we talk about are super hard in concept. We've yet to talk about entanglement theory or any kind of physics. So it's not that hard, but in practice, I think it is hard, especially with the peer pressure of the country, capitalism, marketing too. It's easy and social media. You can post your pictures of your new cars and houses and vacations and everything else, and that feels like from the worldly perspective what winning looks like, but it's a pretty thankless pursuit.
Well, I love your significance versus success. As we say as old Southern Baptists, that'll preach.
Yeah.
And, you can't do much better than to kind of close out with the wise words of Maxwell. You and I both love the guy dearly. And
Yeah. He's a treasure.
anyway, well, this has been good. It's been good for me because I think it's good for all of us to stop and take a moment, step back and say, what is it that's driving me? And is it the right thing? And because it's so easy because of the world that's around us that says, you've got to win. You've got to always do better. Doesn't matter what you did last year. You got to do better this next year. You got to do better than your competitor. Otherwise, you've lost. And we get there's so much pressure in that regard, and then social media has not helped
Yeah.
one bit there. And it's
And I
time
think
for
it
us. I think it's healthy to step back and say, what is my purpose? For Christ followers like us, it's what is God's divine calling on our lives? And
yeah, and
are we doing what is necessary to fulfill that?
I think it would be easy for somebody to listen to this podcast and pick out a few highlights of it or lowlights, whatever they deem, and say, "Oh, these guys don't care about winning." And I think that's not what we said at all.
It's
When
not true.
I think
Right.
results are important, and I think just like the book, Atomic Habits, results will happen if you focus properly on the process and do the right thing. So this is not a we don't care about results, we don't care about winning, anti any of that. We talked about it and we had a whole debate on it. And, it's doing things the right way. We talked about it with the Brendan Sorsby thing. Is that the right way or the wrong way or not? A lot of people had differing opinions on that. But in college athletics right now, I think this is a timely thing to calibrate us all. And our teams may not win, but some other things can matter. Maybe there's some young men that get developed into men long term. There's some other winnings that come out of that. So I think it's good for you and I to both calibrate as we head into a season and maybe prepare to be disappointed over where we think we should be. But I think that's the thing too, and I think that's one of the reasons Saban got out of college football is I don't believe as much as he won on the field. I think people Bobby Bowden was the same way. I think those guys are very misunderstood for what their ultimate, Kirby talks about it a lot. What is their ultimate winning? It's really turning boys into young men and ultimately into successful men long term. And yes, they went about it the right way. So in the piece, it's easy to check off is they won a lot of championships and they did a lot of winning. I don't think that was their ultimate goal. And you hear Saban talk a lot more about it. Kirby talks more about it. Maybe it's easier to talk about it after you won a bunch of championships. If you haven't, maybe you shouldn't talk about it as much. I don't know. But it feels like all that, perceived success worked out pretty well, but I don't think that was ever their end all be all focus. And I think that
It's
can be
interesting
confusing because
as
people just say, "Oh, you don't want to win, you don't care." Again, I'm super competitive. I think Nick Saban's competitive. I think you are. So I don't think you can misconstrue this whole message just to say, everybody gets a trophy. It doesn't matter who wins, who cares." That's not the message. You can win the right way, and it really is what you define as winning and how you go about it. That's really what I think you and I are challenging. It's not the fact that we think winning is bad or you shouldn't pursue that.
it's interesting as we've kind of come to the conclusion here and made me think about a lot of things. And my very early question was, or suggestion was that we needed to define what winning is. And I've changed that a little bit right here at the tail end. And I think what we need to do is maybe seriously step back and determine and define what is a winner and what is a loser. Because I believe you can win and not be a winner. And we certainly know you can lose and not be a loser.
That's right.
So I think we all need to step back and seriously answer that question. What is a winner? Because yeah, if I outscored you 27-24, I won. Does that make me a winner? Not necessarily. Let's define what a winner really is.
Well, I think, and you just alluded to it. I think the important thing for that is I don't think we as individuals should allow other people to define what winning is for us. I
Yeah.
think each of us, if we want to build this kind of in the love your God, love your neighbor thing, we talk about it. The president's not going to fix all of us. Your governor's not going to. Your mayor's not going to. Your city council person's not going to. We could start with fixing us. The easiest thing that we can all potentially do is fix ourselves. And I think that's where, if you talked about it earlier, if we do some of this, the country would be better. Well, how do you do that? It really starts with looking in the mirror each morning and defining what is winning the right way for me and what is significant in my life and for my family. And let me go do that. Turns out if everybody just did that, it wouldn't matter. But it really, I think the problem is we allow others to define what winning is for us. And then that's where you get in that thankless game and you're not even happy because it's not even what you think winning is. You're doing it to impress some other person that's keeping your score for you. I think if we all define what winning looks like for us, which ultimately we've said, kind of the winning is what's significant in success. But what is that? What is the deep rooted, at the end of the day, when we are at the fourth quarter of our life and the time's ticking out, what we look at it and say, man, I think it's important to do that when you're younger than you or I either one are, because you can do some things detrimental in your first half that make the second half more challenging to come back. But I think, early on or wherever you are defining however much time I've got left, what is winning for my life gonna look like that when I lay my head down the last time, I can look at it and say, "Yeah, I think that was to Paul's thing, an intentional life well lived." I think it starts with defining that. If you don't back to what we said about the wars, right? If you don't define them, how do you know what you did? You can keep changing it. I think you gotta make some non-negotiable for me and for my family. This is what we're going to say winning is, on an individual basis, and then go do it.
Yep. Amen.
Good
Well, this
stuff.
has been good. I've enjoyed it. It's been good for me and have really enjoyed this. So
Likewise,
you
always.
have a good week. I look forward to getting back with you next week, man.
Yes, sir. Enjoyed it.
All
Always.
right.
Have a good evening.
Give my love to the family. Tell everybody hi for me there in Huntsville.
You as well.
We'll talk at you later.
See
Thanks.
ya.